Donald Trump's relationship with international financial institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, has been characterized by skepticism and controversial actions. One of the most notable examples of this was the appointment of David Malpass as the World Bank president in 2019. Malpass, a longtime critic of the institution, had openly questioned the World Bank's effectiveness and criticized its lending programs, particularly its financial support for China. He argued that it was inappropriate to extend such support to a nation with significant financial and economic capabilities. Many viewed Malpass's appointment as a reflection of Trump's broader skepticism toward multilateral institutions and an attempt to realign the World Bank's priorities with his America First agenda. This marked a deliberate challenge to the traditional approaches to international development financing and hinted at a potential reduction in the United States' contributions to global financial efforts. Trump's America First philosophy placed considerable strain on multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, as his administration consistently raised concerns about how these institutions allegedly favored other nations, particularly China, at the expense of the United States. Reports from the Associated Press suggested that, during a potential second term, Trump might propose a complete United States withdrawal from both the IMF and the World Bank. This idea was supported by conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, which advocated for an overhaul of the United States' foreign aid and international financial commitments. These proposals were encapsulated in Project 2025, a policy initiative by the Heritage Foundation that called for a reassessment of the United States' involvement in multilateral institutions. Central to this vision was the belief that these organizations served as costly intermediaries that drained the United States' resources while benefiting foreign governments. Proponents argued that withdrawing from these institutions would enable the United States to prioritize domestic financial needs and redirect international assistance through bilateral channels, which they deemed more effective and transparent. The proposals within Project 2025 reflected a broader skepticism of multilateral institutions, emphasizing a shift towards sovereignty and domestic priorities. Critics of the IMF within this framework contended that the institution diminished the United States' influence by pooling resources from multiple nations, thereby limiting direct control over fund allocation. However, these proposals faced significant opposition from domestic and international stakeholders. United States Treasury officials, such as Jay Shambaugh, argued that withdrawing from the IMF would undermine the United States' economic security and global influence. They emphasized that the IMF plays a vital role in ensuring global financial stability, which ultimately benefits the United States, by fostering stable international markets that are crucial for American businesses and investments. Furthermore, they highlighted the strategic advantage of the United States' leadership within the IMF in shaping international financial policies. On a global scale, the idea of United States' withdrawal from the IMF and the World Bank raised concerns about the potential impact on international financial stability. The IMF, for example, plays a central role in managing financial crises, providing emergency funding, and supporting economic recovery in developing and emerging economies. The United States' withdrawal could weaken the institution's ability to respond effectively to crises, create a leadership vacuum, and lead to greater instability in the global financial system. Critics argued that while the proposals aligned with Project 2025's goals of reducing reliance on international organizations, they posed significant risks to the United States' influence and the global economy. The tension between national sovereignty and international cooperation remains a central theme in the debate over these proposals. Interestingly, a potential United States' withdrawal from the IMF and the World Bank could unexpectedly align with long-standing critiques from the Global South, particularly the BRICS nations. Countries in the Global South have often viewed these institutions as instruments of Western dominance, criticizing their loan conditions for imposing austerity and privatization measures that interfere with domestic policies and harm recipient economies. BRICS nations have pushed for a more equitable global financial order and developed alternatives like the New Development Bank to challenge the influence of the IMF and the World Bank. The United States. Exit could weaken Western dominance within these institutions and indirectly support the BRICS' objective of restructuring the global financial system. Trump's criticism of the IMF and the World Bank should also be understood within the context of his broader distrust of multilateral organizations, including NATO, the World Health Organization, WHO, and the United Nations. He often argued that these organizations acted against the United States' interests or failed to provide a fair return on the United States' investments. In a 2020 press conference, for instance, Trump reiterated his skepticism toward foreign aid and international institutions, asserting that the United States should focus on its economic challenges rather than financing global projects. His criticisms implied that the United States was being exploited through unfair trade deals, lending policies, and global aid programs, many of which align with the missions of the IMF and the World Bank. The leadership of the World Bank has long reflected the United States' dominance, as its presidents have exclusively been American nationals since its inception in 1944. This tradition underscores a Western bias that undermines the institution's credibility, particularly in its interactions with the Global South, the very regions it aims to support. Critics argue that this American-dominated leadership often aligns the World Bank's policies with Western economic and political agendas, favoring neoliberal stances that emphasize austerity and privatization. These policies, they claim, exacerbate inequality and hinder sustainable growth in the Global South. Similarly, the IMF's leadership tradition, dominated by Europeans, reinforces a bias toward Western fiscal conservatism. This governance structure, shared by the United States and Europe, centralizes decision-making power within the Western Bloc, sidelining the interests of developing nations and perpetuating a colonial-era viewpoint in global economic governance. The BRICS nations have consistently pushed for reforms to the IMF and the World Bank, advocating for better representation of emerging economies. At the 2014 BRICS Summit, for example, leaders expressed disappointment over the delayed implementation of the 2010 IMF reforms, arguing that this inaction undermined the institution's legitimacy and effectiveness. The United States' withdrawal from these institutions could further highlight the need for reform and potentially pave the way for alternative mechanisms led by the Global South. In this light, Trump's skepticism of multilateral financial institutions may inadvertently contribute to the BRICS agenda of restructuring the global financial order. To understand why many countries express dissatisfaction with international financial institutions like the IMF, it's essential first to explore what constitutes a fair loan. A fair loan provides reasonable terms that encourage sustainable economic growth without overly burdening the borrower. Such loans typically feature fair interest rates, flexible repayment schedules, transparency in conditions, minimal policy restrictions, and a long-term focus on development. Conversely, unfair loans impose harsh terms, including exorbitant interest rates, rigid repayment plans, a lack of transparency, strict policy requirements, and a short-term outlook that can lead to economic strain and a loss of sovereignty for the borrower. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, often prioritizes macroeconomic stabilization through structural adjustment programs, SAPs. These programs enforce measures such as austerity, privatization, deregulation, and trade liberalization. While these policies aim to control inflation and reduce deficits, they frequently come at the cost of national sovereignty, increased poverty, and unemployment. The IMF's one-size-fits-all approach often overlooks the unique economic and social contexts of individual nations, which can lead to debt dependency and the neglect of deeper systemic issues. In contrast, the BRICS New Development Bank, NDB, established in 2015, offers a different model by focusing on infrastructure, renewable energy, and sustainable development projects. The NDB is noted for providing borrower-friendly terms with fewer policy conditions, allowing countries greater economic autonomy. It emphasizes regional cooperation, transparency, and tailored solutions aligned with the specific needs of member nations. However, as a relatively new institution, the NDB has a limited track record and faces challenges in ensuring equitable representation among BRICS member states. The BRICS nations and other countries in the Global South have been calling for reforms to the current IMF and World Trade Organization, WTO, frameworks, which they argue disproportionately favor wealthier nations and fail to adequately address the priorities of developing economies. Their demands include revising the IMF's quota system to grant emerging economies more influence and restoring the WTO's dispute resolution mechanisms. Dissatisfaction with these Western-dominated institutions has spurred efforts to overhaul the financial system and explore alternative institutions that better align with the needs of the Global South. To better understand the origins of dissatisfaction with the IMF, one must examine specific cases where its policies have negatively impacted countries in the Global South. For example, in the mid-1980s, Nigeria faced a severe economic decline characterized by falling oil revenues, rising external debt, and dwindling foreign reserves. In response, General Ibrahim Babangida's administration implemented a Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, in 1986 under the guidance of the IMF. The program aimed to diversify the economy beyond oil exports, promote non-oil industries, and restore fiscal balance. However, the SAP also brought immediate hardship. Currency devaluation led to inflation, raising the cost of essential goods, while the removal of subsidies further burdened low-income households. Public discontent erupted into the anti-SAP riots of 1989, which began at the University of Benin and quickly spread nationwide. Students, workers, and other groups protested against the harsh economic measures, leading to violent clashes with security forces, casualties, and numerous arrests. The SAP's strict policies contracted the economy, increased unemployment, and eroded public trust in the government, leaving a lasting mark on Nigeria's political and social landscape. Similarly, Indonesia suffered devastating consequences during the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s. After the rupiah's value plummeted and inflation soared, President Suharto's administration secured a $43 billion bailout from the IMF in 1997. The accompanying austerity measures triggered public outrage and, by May 1998, escalated into nationwide protests and violent riots. Demonstrators targeted symbols of wealth and authority, with the Chinese-Indonesian community bearing the brunt of the violence. The military's intervention to restore order resulted in over 1,000 deaths. Mounting public discontent eventually forced Suharto to resign after 31 years in power. While the crisis marked the beginning of Indonesia's reformasi era, the IMF-driven austerity measures left a lasting impact, shaping public attitudes toward international financial institutions and influencing economic policy for years. Egypt, too, experienced unrest linked to IMF policies. In January 1977, widespread protests, known as the bread riots, erupted after the government eliminated subsidies on essential food items to secure financial assistance from institutions like the IMF. Prices for staples such as bread, sugar, rice, and cooking oil soared overnight, sparking demonstrations in major cities. Tensions escalated as protesters clashed with authorities, leading to extensive property damage, casualties, and arrests. Under mounting pressure, the Egyptian government reinstated subsidies, but the episode highlighted the social and political risks of IMF-mandated austerity measures. In the late 1990s, Brazil faced a similar dilemma when it sought IMF assistance to stabilize its economy. A $41.5 billion aid package, approved in 1998, required strict austerity measures, including public spending cuts, tax increases, and structural reforms. While these measures were credited with controlling hyperinflation and restoring investor confidence, they also reduced funding for essential services like healthcare and education, disproportionately affecting low-income populations. Public backlash, protests, and strikes ensued, as critics accused the IMF of worsening inequality and hindering social progress. Although Brazil achieved economic stability and repaid its IMF loans early in 2005, the social costs of austerity continued to fuel debates over the balance between economic reform and social welfare. Morocco's experience with IMF-backed austerity measures in the 1980s presents another cautionary tale. To address a large budget deficit and rising debt, King Hassan II's government agreed to cut subsidies on essential food items in 1981. This led to sharp price increases and, subsequently, the Casablanca bread riots. Thousands of impoverished citizens protested against the rising cost of living, targeting symbols of wealth and authority. The government's harsh response, which included deploying police and military forces, resulted in dozens of fatalities and widespread arrests. The unrest underscored the social and political instability that can arise from externally imposed economic policies. These cases illustrate the challenges faced by nations subjected to IMF policies, from economic contraction and increased poverty to public unrest and political instability. While these measures may achieve macroeconomic stabilization, their social costs often outweigh the benefits, fueling dissatisfaction and calls for alternative financial systems that prioritize long-term development and social equity. If you enjoyed this video, do well to support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel.